Well, I'm going to speak today about morphic fields. And morphic fields are the organizing fields of self-organizing systems at all levels of complexity. They underlie the organization of minds, of bodies, of crystals, of plants, of molecules, of stars, and of galaxies. They're the fields that give things their form, their shape, their organization. So I'll be talking about the nature of morphic fields. I'll be talking about the way they have a kind of memory within them through morphic resonance. And I'll be talking about various experiments for testing for their existence. But first, I'm going to start with a very brief history of fields, because the whole theme of our gathering is fields. And the field concept is really a concept that's transforming the whole of science. It wasn't there in the 17th century when mechanistic science got going. The machine metaphor that science was based on from the 17th century onwards was mainly clockwork, and that was the metaphor used for trying to understand the cosmos. But things changed a lot in the 1840s, right here in London. Throughout the 18th century, people had been trying to understand electricity and magnetism to no avail. It was a kind of amateur hobby. Rich gentlemen had electrical and magnetic machines in their houses and gave sort of demonstrations of sparks and electrical attraction and magnetic attraction and repulsion. But no one understood them. Everyone was fascinated by it, but no one understood it. In the 1840s, Michael Faraday, working right here in London, invented the field concept. And he used the English word field, which really means a piece of tilled land, an area with a boundary, already used in English in many different uses: football field, field of interest, field of view, etc. Many normal English uses for this word, all of them meaning a region of activity. An agricultural field, the source of the metaphor, is a region of activity. If you stop cultivating it, it reverts to scrub and finally woodland. It's a region of activity. And he thought that magnets had regions of activity, and so did electrically charged bodies. And he showed that the electrical and magnetic fields interacted. It wasn't until the 1860s that James Clerk Maxwell gave us the equations of electromagnetic field theory and showed that light was an electromagnetic vibration in the electromagnetic field. Now, this then became the basis of electrical technologies and other forms of electromagnetic radiation like X-rays, ultraviolet, infrared, radio waves, none of which were known about before this revolution. It was a completely revolutionary insight into the nature of nature. But what were these fields? Everyone asked Faraday that question, and the answer was he didn't know. He had two theories about the fields. One was that he thought the fields might be fundamental to all nature. Fields are invisible structures in space. In fact, he thought that they may be, as he put it, modifications of mere space. His alternative theory, his less favored theory, was that fields are made of subtle matter, the ether. Well, the 19th century was rather materialistic. Maxwell took up the ether version of Faraday's theory, and all 19th century electromagnetic theory from then on was based on the ether, an invisible form of subtle matter pervading all space. In 1905, Einstein, in his theory of relativity, what Faraday, his idea that they were just modifications of space, in a way, that's what Einstein went back to. In his special theory of relativity, he showed that ether doesn't exist. We don't need the ether. He just got rid of it. The fields are fields. And so people said, what are they made of? He said, they're not made of anything. Fields are fundamental in nature. Matter arises from fields, not fields from matter. Fields are not made of matter, rather matter's made of fields, of energy bound within fields. In his general theory of relativity in 1927, Einstein showed that the universal gravitational field is a field. It's what holds the whole universe together. There's a field that links everything in the universe together. And so that was another kind of field, different from electromagnetic fields. In quantum theory, they came up with quantum matter fields. Electrons and protons and all other particles are vibrations in quantum fields. So what's going on? What is the nature of these fields? Well, the string theory, superstring theory, is an attempt to tie them all together in terms of a grand unified field. But there's another kind of field which physics has so far not recognized, and that's what I call the morphic field, the fields that organize the forms and shapes of self-organizing systems. And those are the fields I'm going to talk about now. Well, here's a magnetic field, and the point to realize here is that the field is not just within the magnet, it's all around it. It's outside the boundaries of the material object. Fields are more extensive than material objects. And this is why the philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper, said that through modern physics, materialism has transcended itself because its fundamental explanatory entity is not matter, but fields and energy. Matter is less fundamental than fields and energy. And since materialism is based on the doctrine, the most fundamental thing is matter, this is no longer true. And here you see the pattern in space around the magnet revealed by iron filings. If you took the iron filings away, the field would still be there. The invisible structure would still be there. Now, in the 1920s, biologists working on the development of fungi, plants, and animals came up with a biological field concept. Nobody understood then, and they still don't understand today, how embryos develop, how a complex organism like ourselves arises from a fertilized egg with very little structure. And the idea was that developing organisms are shaped by form-shaping fields, morphogenetic fields. Morphogenesis means the coming into being of form. Morphe means form. Genesis means coming into being. Morphogenesis is the way that animals and plants, all living organisms, or even crystals, have forms that come into being. They weren't there before. After a formative process, they are there now. More structure comes from less. The idea was that this process was guided and shaped by morphogenetic fields, fields that shape the forms of living organisms. They're like invisible plans or blueprints. The reason we need this is that DNA and chemicals alone can't explain morphogenesis. All biologists agree on this. Molecular biology has made it even clearer that this is the case. Think of your arms and legs. They have different shapes, and yet they have exactly the same genes. In fact, all the cells of your body have the same genes, the same so-called genetic program. Yet they're all different. Your eyes, your spleen, your liver, your kidneys, they're all different. And your arms and legs are different. The arms and legs have the same chemicals. Chemically, they're identical. Yet they have different shapes. Why? Well, you can't explain it in terms of chemistry or DNA. You need a kind of plan, an architectural plan, and that's what the morphogenetic field provides. It's a bit like an architectural plan of a building. You could build two houses completely different in shape out of the same building materials, bricks, cement, timber, etc. The difference between the two houses is not in the matter they're made of, nor in the amount of energy involved in building them. It could be the same for both houses. It's the plan that underlies them. And that's what these fields do. They provide the order, the structure, the plan, or if you like, the information, where information means that which puts form into something, information. That's what the fields are doing. Here's another example of an electromagnetic field revealing that the sun has an electromagnetic field that stretches out throughout the entire solar system. The Earth has a magnetic field. When they interact, this is called the magnetopause. Around the Earth, as a tail stretches out for many millions of miles into space, and it's constantly vibrating and oscillating. This field nature of the universe is what we're only in the 20th century and the 21st century coming to realize. In the 19th century, and certainly at the time of Newton, the universe was seen just in terms of the bare bones of matter, gravitation was what was the obsession of all astronomers. But this has, as it were, put the flesh on the bare bones of the gravitational view of the universe, showing the field nature of everything, of the Earth itself. Now, when we come to embryos, this is an embryo of a bat. All of this develops from a fertilized egg, which has very little structure to start with. How do all these different limbs, these structures come into being? What tells the cells what to do? The answer that within biology is now a very mainstream answer is the morphogenetic fields of the bat. That's what shapes it, there's a kind of invisible shaping blueprint. Here you see a series of stages in the development of a nematode worm, a humble worm, with only a few thousand cells. It starts with an egg cell that divides in two, and then you see it going through a series of stages until this consists of many, many, many different cells with all different structures within it. These fields that shape developing organisms are different. Each organism has its own kind of field. And one reason why biologists liked and still like the idea of morphogenetic fields is because fields are intrinsically holistic. You can't take a slice out of the Earth's gravitational field. You can't take a slice out of magnetic field. If you try and cut the North Pole off a magnet, you just chop the North Pole end off a magnet, you don't end up with an isolated North Pole. You end up with two magnets, each with a complete magnetic field. Now, this is the very nature of fields. They're holistic, they interconnect, they give form, structure, pattern, and connect things together in a whole. If you cut magnets into little pieces, you get lots of little magnets, each with a complete field. Now, that's totally different from the way machines work. Machines are made of parts put together artificially in factories that work together in the entire machine, but it doesn't have an overall organizing field that makes it a whole. If you cut a machine up, a computer up into small pieces, all you get is a broken computer. So field phenomena are very different. And living organisms are much more like field phenomena than like machines. If you cut up a machine, you just get a broken machine. But if you cut up or damage an embryo, that's not what happens. Here you see a normal dragonfly embryo inside the dragonfly egg. In this one, the egg was tied off and this part was killed. The back half of the egg would, in a normal case, have just given the back half of the embryo. But in fact, this part of the egg now has a complete but small embryo within it. So by damaging this, this now has a complete morphogenetic field, like half a magnet. It has a complete magnetic field, and it leads to a normal embryo forming. No machine would do that kind of thing. We see the same with regeneration. If you cut a plant up into lots of little bits, each cutting can become a whole new plant. Willow trees are particularly good at forming cuttings, and you can make thousands of cuttings from a willow tree. This is a flatworm that, cut up into 3 bits here, each of the bits can regenerate. The tail bit regenerates a new middle part and head. The middle bit gets a new head and tail. If you cut it acrosswise, you get a new worm. If you cut it in half, from top to bottom, it regenerates a new half. Each of these fragments has the field of the complete worm associated with it, just like a fragment of a magnet has a complete field, which leads to this regenerative healing process. These are limbs of a newt, and in this case, the newt's arm was amputated at this point here. On this side, it was amputated at this point, much further down. In both cases, the stump regenerates a whole new leg. And again, this is best understood in terms of the field which remains associated with the limb, even though the limb has been cut off. Now, we have much less regenerative capacity than newts. You cut off a person's arm, it doesn't regenerate. We do have, of course, regenerate in many of our tissues, the skin, the intestinal lining, the liver. We do have considerable regenerative powers. Without them, we wouldn't heal after damage. But less than a newt. However, I think even human beings after losing limbs still have the field of the missing limb, and I think that's what underlies the phantom limb phenomenon. I think people with phantom limbs are feeling the field of their missing limb. It's where the limb should be, and that's where the phantom's experience. People can move around their phantom limbs. And one of my experiments at the moment is trying to detect phantom limbs, the field of the limb. You can read about that in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. It's a very good, a very simple experiment, and any of you who are involved in subtle healing might like to consider trying it. It costs nothing, and it's fun to do. Here's a form of regeneration that's even more remarkable. This was done deliberately in the laboratory with the eye of a newt. The lens was surgically removed from the eye of a newt to produce a form of damage that would never normally happen in nature. What happens is that the edge of the iris forms a new lens and regenerates a perfect functional eye. Now, in the embryonic development of a newt, the lens does not form from the edge of the iris, it forms from a folding in of skin on the outside. So it's formed a lens in a completely new way from a different tissue from where it would normally arise from, showing that there seems to be a plan of the complete eye, that take away the lens, that plan is still there, and it enables the regeneration process to occur. An important concept in the understanding of morphogenetic fields was put forward by the British biologist C.W. Waddington. Waddington had the idea of a creode, which is a canalized pathway of change. It's as if this is the embryo. It rolls down valleys towards the lowest points. These represent different organs in the body. What this illustrates is that it's attracted towards the end state, the fully formed organ, which acts as an attractor. In the language of modern dynamics, morphogenetic fields contain attractors which attract the developing system towards that end or goal. If you push the wall up the valley, if you disturb the normal course of development, as in the case of the dragonfly embryo cutting a bit of the egg off, what happens is that it rolls back to the normal pathway of development. These walls mean that even after disturbance, it can get back onto the normal course and ends up in the normal endpoint. So the creode is an important part. Morphogenetic fields are not static. They contain virtual future forms which attract the developing organism towards them. As a seedling develops towards a tree, the mature form of the tree is the attractor for that seedling. As an embryo develops towards an adult, the adult form is the attractor for that developmental process. And it pulls it towards this goal. The modeling of morphogenetic fields in mathematical terms has been done by a great French mathematician, René Thom, who put together this whole attractor theory of fields. The attractor mathematics is the basis of chaos theory and a number of other important branches of modern dynamics. But this is the mathematical nature of these fields. The other important general point about fields is that they're hierarchically organized. They exist in nested hierarchies, parts within wholes, which are holes within this whole, which includes these parts, is a part of this whole, that's part of this whole. These could be subatomic particles in atoms, atoms in molecules, molecules in crystals, or they could be organelles in cells, cells in tissues, tissues in organs, organs in organisms, organisms in societies. Everywhere you look in nature, there are levels of organization. The parts of one are wholes that they're in their own level, containing parts which are also wholes at a lower level. Arthur Koestler called these holons, and he called this pattern of organization a holarchy. You could also call it a nested hierarchy. The higher level is a level that includes the lower levels. It's a bit like those addresses that some of us wrote as children, you know, the house, the street, the town, the county, England, UK, Europe, the world, the universe, and so on. There's always a higher level of organization, and each contains lower levels. And the point about holistic science is that it recognizes that nature's made up of a series of levels or wholes. Reductionist science, still the predominant form within universities, tries to reduce everything to the smallest possible thing. That's why in biology, molecular biology is the most prestigious and important and best funded branch of the subject, because molecules are the smallest things. It's why in physics, particle physics is the best funded branch, because these evanescent particles that last only tiny fractions of a second are the smallest and most elusive things. You have to build apparatus costing billions of euros in order to study them, because they're the smallest things. And the reason why people bother is because they think that's where the answer lies, in the smallest things. Holistic science tells us that's not the case. There's a whole series of levels, and to understand any level, you have to study things at their own level. So morphogenetic fields exist in a nested hierarchy. The field of an organelle is inside the field of a cell, the field of a cell inside the field of the tissue of the tissue inside the field of the organ. And these fields work on the fields of lower level systems, giving them order, structure, and pattern. So this is a general overview of the nature of morphogenetic fields. And I suggest that that's just one kind of organizing field. The nervous system is highly indeterminate in its behavior, and that is organized by another set of fields, the behavioral fields. Mental activity is organized by mental fields. Social groups like flocks of birds or termite colonies are organized by social fields. All these kinds of fields are what I call morphic fields. Morphic field is the general category of which morphogenetic field is one species. It's the kind of field concerned with the development of form in animals and plants and crystals. The behavior is governed by behavioral fields, social organization by social fields, and so forth. So these are all different kinds of morphic field. Now, how do morphic fields have the form they have? And how do they work? Well, I don't have time to go into all the details, but roughly speaking, how they work is by imposing pattern or structure on otherwise indeterminate or chaotic processes. Everything in nature is, except for some human machines, is pretty well indeterminate. Chaos theory and quantum theory have revealed to us that the old illusion of science that everything is in principle totally predictable is not true. It was just an illusion. Most of nature is very unpredictable. That's why, even with satellite photos, the weather forecasters don't always get it right, because the weather is a chaotic system. It doesn't obey simple deterministic principles, nor do breaking waves, nor do nervous systems, nor do biological organisms. Everything's probabilistic. If you look at all the different leaves on a particular tree, they all have the same genes, they have the same morphic fields, yet every leaf is different. The vein pattern is different on every leaf. They're even different on different sides of the same leaf. They all have the same general form, the same probability structure, but they're individually different. Morphic fields impose pattern on probabilistic processes. They impose pattern on developing organisms. They impose pattern on the activity of the nervous system. So they underlie behavior as well. And they also underlie social organization. So how do they get the form themselves? Is this all programmed in the genes? Well, no, because genes, we know what they do. They code for proteins. They enable us to make the particular proteins that our bodies contain. That's all. Some of them are involved in the control of protein synthesis. They don't explain the form of an organism. The genes give us the components that we have in our bodies, a bit like the components in a TV set. They're essential for that TV set to work properly. If you have defective components, the set doesn't work properly. But the pictures you see on the screen and the sounds you hear are not arising from those components by themselves. They depend on an invisible field to which the set is tuned. And that's the same with organisms. The inheritance of form and behavior depends on morphic fields. So how do these fields evolve? Living organisms evolve. And science, old-style science, isn't really a very evolutionary subject. We now know the entire cosmos is evolutionary. But how do fields evolve? They can't just be in the genes because they're what organize the genes. So they can't be inherited genetically. They can't just be Platonic equations, equations somehow beyond time and space, because fields evolve. dinosaurs came into being, they're now extinct. Animals, birds evolved from dinosaurs. The fields of birds evolved. They weren't all there at the moment of the Big Bang or even at the origin of life on Earth. How do they evolve and change in time? They have a kind of history within them. The suggestion I make is that morphic fields have a kind of memory given by a process called morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is the influence of similar patterns of activity on subsequent similar patterns of activity across space and time. What matters is similarity. It doesn't matter about distance in space and time. Anything that's happened before in a self-organizing system will make it easier for that to happen again. So there's a kind of collective memory in every kind of thing. Each species of plant has a kind of collective memory. Each species of animals has a kind of collective memory, a memory of form, of the way the organism develops, and of behavior. The collective memory of animals are their instincts, their inherited patterns of behavior. And we, of course, have a collective memory as well. It's what Jung called the collective unconscious. So this collective memory is a key feature of all of nature. The whole of nature is really a matter of habit. And I see the so-called laws of nature as more like habits. Well, I think, in fact, whether we like it or not, that's a view everybody's going to have to consider sooner or later. Old-style science was based on the idea that the laws of nature are completely fixed. That they used to think nature is eternal. The laws of nature are eternal, matter and energy are eternal, and it's just a matter of things just repeating in endless cycles and so forth. But evolution tells us something completely different. The laws of nature can't be eternal. The universe is not eternal. So the laws of nature are not eternal, and if the whole universe is evolving, at least the laws have to evolve, but better than law is the idea of habit. So I'm suggesting the laws of nature are more like habits. The morphic fields have a kind of inherent memory. So everything has this kind of memory, even crystals. What this means is that if you make a new kind of crystal that's never existed before, there won't be a morphic field for that crystal form. You have to wait for one to come into being. But if you, excuse me, if you keep crystallizing the same thing over and over again, making crystals all over the world, it'll get easier and easier to crystallize. Things will form more readily. This is known to happen in the case of crystals. They get easier to crystallize the more often they're made. Chemists usually explain this by saying that fragments of previous crystals travel around the world on the clothing or beards of migrant chemists and infect crystallization dishes in other laboratories. Or if there haven't been any migrant chemists, they move around as invisible dust particles in the atmosphere. But what I'm saying is this would still happen even if the dust particles are filtered out and if migrant chemists are rigorously excluded. Things will get easier to crystallize because of morphic resonance. There's a habit building up in nature. Now, I think this happens at all levels, not just in crystals. It happens in biological form. Whenever a habit builds up, it means that things are influenced by all the previous systems. So the more there are, the greater the number of influences. There's a cumulative memory. All the previous systems are slightly different. So it's a kind of probability structure. This illustrates this probability structure of morphic fields with the analogy of composite photographs. These are average scientists from the John Innes Institute in Norwich, made by superimposing the photos of female and male scientists. And so we get an average scientist's face from the John Innes Institute. I think one thing we can guess is that they were predominantly white. Anyway, if you could see the morphic field of a scientist at the John Innes Institute, it'd be a bit like this, a kind of blurred, average, probabilistic structure. So these fields include the memory of everything that's happened before of that kind. It's a kind of collective memory. Now, I'm just going to talk about a few experiments that relate to this. This is a normal fruit fly, and this is a mutant fruit fly where the balancing organs, the Holters, have been transformed into an extra pair of wings. These flies with 4 wings are a bit like the ancestors of flies, dragonflies, which had 4 wings. So the fruit fly, through changes in genes, it's as if they flip the channel, and these developing structures develop into wings, not whole hairs. It's like flipping a channel on your TV set. They affect a switch. But you can produce the same effect, for reasons no one understands, by changing the environment of fruit flies. If you expose 3-hour-old fruit fly eggs to fumes of ether, I now mean diethyl ether, the anesthetic, the flies that develop, some of them, develop with 4 wings instead of 2. This is a developmental abnormality, a bit like thalidomide causing human abnormalities. Without genetic change, it just affects it disturbs development. Now, it was discovered by Waddington, the man who put forward the creode idea, that if you keep doing this generation after generation, more and more flies develop abnormally. He thought at first it was a genetic selection effect, but the experiment was repeated at the Open University by Dr. Mei Wan Ho and her colleagues. And over a series of generations, with an inbred strain where you could have no genetic selection effect, they looked at the proportion that went, these are the generations, this is the proportion with 4 wings. First generation about 2%, the next generation about 7%, and so on until they got up to about 35%. And in some cases, they stopped exposing the eggs to ether, but still, for generations, at a declining rate, they went on forming 4-winged flies. The interesting point from my point of view is this. After they'd done this, at the time of the 10th generation, they got some fresh flies of the same strain. They exposed them to ether. The first generation were transformed to 10%, the second generation to 20%, compared with 2% and 6% the first time round. After all these flies had developed abnormally, it became easier for other flies to show the same abnormal form of development. And I would say that was because of morphic resonance. It has nothing to do with genes, and there was no genetic connection between the new batch of flies and the ones that had been treated previously. Now, the same principles apply to the organization of nervous activity and learning. The theory predicts that if you train rats to learn a new trick in one place, like London, rats all over the world should learn the same thing more quickly, just because the rats here have learned it. There's a kind of collective memory. And when I first thought of this, I thought if that's true, people should have noticed this. They're training rats to learn new tricks all the time in labs. I looked in the rat literature, and I found that, in fact, this was already observed in a fascinating series of experiments started by William McDougall at Harvard in the 1920s. Rats were trained to escape from a water maze by swimming to an exit. If they swam to the wrong exit, they got an electric shock. I mean, it's one of those old-style give them shocks type experiments. No one would do that today, luckily, but anyway, he did it then. What he found was that the first generation of rats made hundreds of errors before they learned. He bred from them, and the second generation made fewer errors, and the third made fewer still, and so on. And he thought he'd shown an inheritance of acquired characteristics. Those of you who've studied biology will know that this is the ultimate heresy in biology. You're not meant to have an inheritance of acquired characteristics. What the parents do is not supposed to affect the offspring, because it's all supposed to be coded in the genes which are passed on unchanged. We've seen from the fruit flies that's not true. The changing development of the parents did affect the offspring and indeed all other flies of that breed. And the same happens, what was happening with McDougall's rats is he thought it was genetic. And some of his critics, it was very, very controversial, the critics said, oh, well, there's just a flaw in your experiment. You're breeding from these rats, so obviously you're taking the ones that learn quickest as the parents because you can breed the next generation sooner. And you're unconsciously ignoring the stupid ones that take a long time to learn, so it's just ordinary genetic selection. Everyone seemed pleased by that, it was conventional. But McDougall came back and said, okay, I'll test that theory. In every generation, I'll take as the parents of the next generation the most stupid rats, the slowest learners. Genetic selection should mean they'd make more and more errors as time goes on. this is what happened. The number of errors fell generation by generation from over 200 to start with down to about 30. And this was with stupid rats. It should have been going up like this, the number of errors. In fact, they were getting better and better as time went on. What was happening? Genetic selection couldn't explain this. People were outraged, and people tried to repeat his experiments in two universities, Edinburgh in Scotland and Melbourne, Australia. They started off with similar rats, and when they started training their rats in the same apparatus, they started where the Harvard rats had left off, around here. The ones in Scotland got better and better. Even so, they started off learning faster. And then people said, well, there must be something wrong. And the Australians said, OK, you haven't included control rats. In every generation, we'll test not only ones descended from trained parents, but rats from a standard line, the same breed, whose parents have never been exposed to these water mazes. What they found was that both lots got better and better. And that proved it wasn't genetic. It was nothing to do with modifying genes. So everyone heaved a sigh of relief and said, OK, this refutes Lamarckian inheritance, nothing to do with modifying genes, and the whole episode was closed. And these data were left gathering dust in the archives. But nobody explained the effect itself. The effect itself fits perfectly with morphic resonance. Now, the same should apply to human beings. It should be getting easier and easier to learn computer programming, windsurfing, paragliding, and every other sport and skill that's come on the scenes in recent years. Actually, people do seem to get better at learning them, but it could be improved educational videos, better training techniques, new technologies, seeing it on TV. There's lots of factors that affect this. To study this, you need to have standardized experiments or observations where the same test is done over and over again. And in the 1980s, I realized that one perfect source of data for this would be IQ tests. IQ tests have been done in much the same way over many, many years. And morphic resonance would predict that people should be getting better at doing IQ tests, not because they're getting more intelligent, but the tests should be getting easier because so many people have already done them. And I couldn't get hold of the data to test this. But luckily, a New Zealand scientist called James Flynn took up exactly this question and found that just this sort of thing was happening. This shows the rise in average IQ test scores in the United States from 1918 to 1989. And as you see, there was a dramatic and puzzling rise in IQ test scores. Not to be outdone, people have found that the same has happened in Britain, Germany, Japan. In fact, everywhere people have looked, they've seen the same rising IQ score effect. This is now called the Flynn effect, after James Flynn. And what is the explanation? There's been tremendous controversy within the psychology world. People at first said, well, it must be better nutrition, it must be urbanization, and so on. But none of these things worked out in explaining it. People investigated different countries, and they found that these might explain a small part. Being more used to doing tests at school, television making people smarter. Well, no, most people thought it made them dumber. None of these explanations. There've been hundreds of papers in the psychological literature battling out over this. No one can explain it. It's exactly what you'd expect on the basis of morphic resonance. Now, you can do special tests for morphic resonance, and I'll talk about one or two of those in a moment. But a very interesting new kind of test came up just a few years ago. Our oldest son, who was then 16, was doing GCSE, and he came up to me one day and said, I and my friends have been discussing our GCSE exams, and we've come up with an idea of boosting our scores with no extra effort. And I said, well, that sounds good. How are you going to do that? And he said, by morphic resonance. So I said, well, how's that going to work? He said, take the physics or maths exams. There are 16 questions. We're going to do questions 15 and 16 first, and then go back and do 1, 2, 3, 4. That way we'll be 10 minutes behind everyone else in Britain, and we'll get a boost from morphic resonance. Well, I said, well, I said, well, I'm all too familiar with the dynamics of morphic resonance discussions. I said, there must have been a skeptic in the room who said, what if morphic resonance doesn't really happen? He said, yes, indeed, there was someone who said that. And he said, we worked it out that if it doesn't happen, we wouldn't lose anything. But if it does, we'd get extra points. And they all did it, actually, and did rather well in their exams. This suggested to me a whole new way of testing for morphic resonance. And as it happens, the head of the Cambridge OCR, Oxford, Cambridge, and Royal Society of Arts Science Examination Board is an old friend of mine from Cambridge. And I suggested to him that they could, just by changing the order in the science exams, turn the whole of Britain into a national laboratory for morphic resonance testing. He loved the idea, but he didn't dare implement it. But when I was talking about this in a lecture in Holland, I was amazed at the reaction of the audience there. What people said to me is, they looked at me incredulously and said, in England, does everyone do the exams in the same order? The questions in the same order? I said, yes. They said, oh, we don't here. They said, the exams come in two alternative versions, A and B. There'd be questions 1 to 8 and 9 to 16 in one paper, but the other version has 9 to 16 and now 1 to 8, and the others at the other one. And I said, why? And they said, so people sitting at adjacent desks, they get papers A, B, A, B. They're always sitting next to someone answering a different question, so they can't cheat. So the entire Dutch national examination system is in fact set up as a morphic resonance experiment. And my friend and colleague Dick Beerman at the University of Amsterdam has already examined 8 papers from the psychology exams in the University of Amsterdam. In 7 out of 8, the questions done afterwards had higher scores than those done before. His assistant is now examining a whole range of going into the archives and getting out a whole lot of new exam results, or old exam results rather, from the university. And then if that works, we could try and do it with the entire Dutch school examination system. So luckily, this experiment has actually already been carried out for totally different reasons. Now, there's a number of tests I've been trying over the years for morphic resonance. One of them involves puzzle pictures. Now, take a look at this picture, and hidden within it is a hidden image. I'm going to show you the answer in a moment, and I'm going to ask you to tell me if you spotted it. Very few of you will have done, that I predict. Okay, here's the answer. And here's the image again. Now, how many people got that? Oh, yes. So it's probably about 4 to 3%, something like that. It's about the average level. Okay, here's another one. Okay, here's the answer. Now, how many of you got that one? A few more, yes. Good, thanks. Well, this is an experiment, one of my first experiments for morphic resonance. It was done on TV. And what we did is we had 2 puzzle pictures like this, which are very difficult ones. We tested groups of people in Germany and in other parts of Europe. And we found out how many could recognize the hidden image. Then one of them was selected at random and shown on BBC television, in fact on Tomorrow's World, to 8 million viewers. And they were all shown the answer. So 8 million people got it, just like you've got it. This is a very rapid form of learning. If you see these pictures again in a year's time, you'll probably get them straight away. The question was, did it make it easier for people to get that picture on the continent? We tested fresh batches of people there, and sure enough, the one that had been shown in Britain became easier to recognize in Germany than the other one. We then did it again on ITV, and it worked very well the second time. These results were published in New Scientist and so on. And then German television wanted to do it, so they asked me to do a third experiment where the pictures were shown in Germany, and we tested people here in Britain. Well, that gave a terribly puzzling response. I predicted that it would make it easier for people to recognize the puzzle picture in England when the Germans had seen it. The skeptics predicted there'd be no significant difference, no effect at all. Nobody predicted that Germans seeing it on a Sunday afternoon would make it harder for people in England to recognize, but that's what happened. So There was an effect, but it was a completely puzzling effect that no one's been able to explain. And it slightly set back this line of research because although it gave very interesting results, these are incredibly difficult experiments to organize. You have to get thousands of people tested and so on. And it was clear that it was not going to give instant, clear-cut results. So that's one test. There's a whole variety of other tests that have been run for morphic resonance, and what you did just now was one of them. It was discovered by none other than Gary Schwartz, who we heard about earlier, in the 1980s. One of his first types of unconventional research was morphic resonance. And when he was a professor at Yale, he did some fascinating morphic resonance tests involving Hebrew words written in Hebrew. And he found that people who didn't know Hebrew could actually unconsciously recognize real Hebrew words compared with false words, anagrams of real words. The point being this: when you read, you don't read a word by spelling out, like a 6-year-old, the different letters. You don't read cat by spelling out k, a, t. You see the whole word as a pattern. It's a gestalt, a pattern, a form. And you've seen it millions of times, and so have lots of other people. And there's a kind of morphic field for recognizing these words. Schwartz's argument was, this should make real words easier to recognize, even for people who don't know the language, than false words, because so many people have seen that pattern before. An anagram contains exactly the same letters, like TCA, is the same letters as cat, but it doesn't mean anything and wouldn't have been recognized by millions of people. People have done this kind of experiment with versions of it, with Persian words, with Arabic words, with Japanese hiragana words, and they've all given significant positive results. What I'm doing now is trying to extend that line of research using Greek words, and the experiment you did just now involved real and false Greek words. Of the 8 Greek words you saw, to start with, 4 were real Greek words, and 4 were anagrams of words. The question is, when you then came to try and remember them, would you be able to remember the words more easily in the case of the real words than the false words, even though you didn't know that some were real and false? Now, I've done this test several times already, and in most of the experiments, but not all, the real words were indeed significantly easier for people to recognize. That's why I'm trying to replicate it with a completely new set of Greek words. This experiment has never been done before with these particular words. It'll take a while for my assistant to mark these hundreds of papers, so this is not an instant result. But if this is a promising line of research, it would be very easy to put this on the internet. You could see the words for 10 seconds, the answer sheet could come up, you could just click on them, the whole thing could be automatically scored. It would be very easy to automate this kind of experiment. Well, there are various ways in which one can test for morphic resonance in chemistry, in physics, in biology, in psychology, in collective memory. I've just touched on a few of them. You can read about this kind of research in my books, A New Science of Life and The Presence of the Past. What I want to do now is to move on to talk about the extended mind. And I'm not going to talk about all aspects of the extended mind, there won't be time for that, but I'm going to talk about the way that our minds are extended out, or at least our whole being is extended out as members of social groups. All social organisms form groups by definition, and the groups have to be coordinated. This is just to remind you the nature of morphic fields. These could be organisms like people or birds, and then the higher level of organization is the social group, like a flock of birds or a human family or a football team, a social group in which the different parts are coordinated together to work as a group. And this is the nature of social organisms. And I'm suggesting that social organization depends on morphic fields. Here you see a flock of birds over Brighton West Pier. These are starlings, and they form these spectacular groups. And films of flocks of this kind, when slowed down, have shown that when they can all change direction at the same time, they're not following a leader. There's what's called a maneuver wave, moves through the flock. And the best computer models of this are as field phenomena. They seem to act like a field, a bit like iron filings moving when you move a magnet over them. The individual birds are responding to the field of the group. And here we see a variety of formations, these are all a starling flock. It shows you something of the amazing variety of forms and shapes these flocks can take up. The maneuver wave can start anywhere in the flock. They're not doing it by looking at a leader. It can start even from the back of the flock. It's not even done by just vision, looking. They're not always looking over their shoulders to see if birds behind them are moving. And the speed at which they move through the flock is far too fast for them to respond just by looking at neighbors. So this is a kind of field phenomenon. And we see a very similar thing with schools of fish. And here, this remarkable school of fish, they're swimming in this direction, is moving, you see, like a single organism. All social groups have fields, I think, which coordinate their activities. And if we look at if we think about this, it's very often the case that animals split up, social groups split up. For example, in wolves, the adult wolves go hunting, leaving the cubs behind in the den with a babysitter. And they go hunting over hundreds of miles in the Canadian north, for example. It's not when they've gone away from the young that they've forgotten about them or the social group's been dissolved. It hasn't. The social group has stretched. The field joining them is like an elastic band. It stretches and continues to connect them at a distance. And I think that social field, linking the members at a distance, is the basis for connection between them at a distance, which we call telepathy. Telepathy means distant feeling. Tele as in television, distant, pathy as in empathy, feeling. So I think that the coordination of animal groups, including at a distance, as well as when they're close together, depends on morphic fields, and it enables them to keep in touch at a distance. There's good evidence from naturalists' observations of wolves that they are in a kind of telepathic contact with others. And I think this is true of many animal species. It's been very little studied by biologists, but I think telepathy is a normal, natural means of animal communication. It's normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. It's a normal form of communication between members of animal groups. And I think most animals are much better at it than most people. So I don't think it's especially a human thing at all. It's a normal, natural, biological phenomenon. It's very analogous to something Lynn talked about earlier, namely quantum entanglement. If two particles have been part of the same system and then they move apart, they remain connected with each other through what's called quantum non-locality or quantum entanglement. So a change in this one instantly affects the other. When Einstein first realized quantum theory predicted that, he said quantum theory must be wrong, because if it's true, it would allow for what he called a spooky action at a distance. Experiments have shown Einstein was wrong. There really is a spooky action at a distance underlying quantum theory. And this is one of its more profound and interesting implications. So the interesting thing also about quantum non-locality is it doesn't fall off with distance. It doesn't matter how far apart they are, the connection's just as strong. That's true of telepathy as well. All experimental research and anecdotal research, in that case history research on telepathy, has shown no dependence on distance. Sometimes people say that proves it doesn't exist because everything in nature falls off with distance. Not true. The thing that's most analogous, quantum non-locality, does not fall off with distance. So I think that this kind of connection between bonded members of groups is normal. And because I think it's a normal part of animal behavior, I started investigating it in animals. And the animals I investigated it in most were pets, animals we know best, animals that people form bonds with and which form bonds with people, and which people have the best opportunity to observe. We know far more about our pet animals than about any other kind of animal. And yet science on the whole has ignored all the vast riches of data that exist from observations of pets. There's been a kind of taboo against taking pets seriously within science. There's also, of course, a taboo against telepathy and other forms of communication at a distance, other than those allowed by technology or normal physical causes. So this area had been much neglected. When I first started this research in the late 80s, early 90s, the first step was to find out what people had noticed. And I launched appeals for information through newspapers, magazines, TV, radio. And I soon had hundreds, thousands of stories that people sent me about pets coming in. I realized soon that I'd sort of overreached myself. My study was ankle deep in handwritten letters. This was before emails became so common. And I just didn't know how to catalogue this. A friend then advised me about filing systems and how to set up databases, and then someone helped me with computer databases, and that is a brilliant way of dealing with it. I now have all this on a computerized database, FileMaker Pro, and I can now have any number of stories in many different categories, and it's very easy to search the database and build up a kind of natural history. Some people say you shouldn't pay attention to people's stories. Well, why not? Science is meant to be empirical. Empirical means based on experience. And if people tell you about their experience, that surely should be the starting point for science, not something you dismiss. Well, we got it back. In fact, I agree with some of my colleagues who said that the plural of anecdote is data. And if you have lots of stories, they add up to a kind of overall pattern, a natural history. The natural history shows many different forms of behavior that cats, dogs, horses, parrots, and other domestic animals show in response to their owners' intentions. I also have many other unexplained categories of behavior, like animals responding before earthquakes and tsunamis and so forth. But now I'm just going to talk about telepathy. Many cat owners have noticed, for instance, that their cats pick up their intention to take them to the vet. They disappear. And this happens so often that some people desperately try not to give the cat any clues. They don't let it see the carrying basket. They say to themselves, I mustn't think about the vet. I mustn't think about the vet. They still disappear. Some people in desperation try ringing the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation. And then they swing by after work to pick up the cat and take it to the vet, and it's not there. We heard so many of these stories that I organised a survey of all 65 veterinary clinics in the North London Yellow Pages, and we asked them if they ever had a problem with people missing appointments with their cat. 64 out of 65 said, yes, it happens all the time. The remaining ones said it happened so often they'd given up the appointment system for cats. People just have to arrive with their animals. The phenomenon that's in fact easiest to study is a very common one, dogs and cats that know when their owners are coming home. Many people have dogs or cats that go and wait by a door or window when a member of the family is on the way home. And if this happens at a routine time, no one thinks it's very odd. It could just be a biological clock. If it happens only a minute or two before, it could be hearing footsteps in the street, the crunch of car wheels on the gravel, that kind of thing. But in many households, it happens 10 minutes, half an hour even in advance. And what's more, it happens when people come home at non-routine times. When I was first launching appeals for this, I ran an appeal in my hometown local newspaper, Newark, Nottinghamshire. And I was talking to the editor of the Newark Advertiser about this, and he said, oh, I think this is completely credible. He said, I notice this all the time. He said, I leave the office at unpredictable hours. He said, but my wife always knows when I've left because the dog goes and starts waiting at the door. And he said, sometimes, he said, it's embarrassing for me because he said, sometimes I decide on the way home to go and visit someone or stop off for a drink. And when I get home, my wife says, where have you been, Roger? You left the office 2 hours ago. So we found many, many, many cases where this happens. We did random household surveys to find out how frequent. It turns out that about 50% of dogs do it, about 30% of cats. Not necessarily because cats are less sensitive. I think just some of them are less interested. Anyway, I've done hundreds of videotaped experiments on this phenomenon. We videotape the place the dog waits the whole time the person's out. We have them go out at least 5 miles away. We have them come home at randomly chosen times that they don't know in advance. The people at home don't know when they're coming. Sometimes there is no one at home. The videotapes, which are time-coded, are analysed independently by independent observers to find out whenever the dog goes to the window. What they show is over and over and over again, dogs go and start waiting when their owners form the intention to come home before they've even got into the car. These experiments have been replicated with different dogs. The results are published in scientific journals. You can find the full texts on my website. And this line of research is now being revived. There's an American website organizing something called open source science, particularly in America, where we're launching an appeal for people with pets that do this to take part in a new wave of experiments. But this is a relatively common phenomenon, and I'd be interested to know actually how many people here have or have had dogs or cats that know when they're coming home. Well, that's an amazing number, actually, higher than a normal proportion. So we're not talking about obscure phenomena here. We're talking about something that's really quite common in many households. I do have a video here. This shows one of these experiments. It was filmed with a British dog, but it was filmed by Austrian television, which is why the soundtrack's in German. But don't worry, it was an English-speaking dog. So this is the dog, JT. His owner's called Pam. And this is a classic experiment on this phenomenon.
Wir wollen es jetzt genau wissen und machen die Probe aufs Exempel. Ein Experiment mit 2 Kameras.
So doing an experiment with 2 cameras, one to film the dog at home in her parents' flat,
Wenn Pam das Haus verlässt.
the other to film Pam.
Vergleichen zu können, was Pam und JT im selben Moment tun, werden die Timecodes der beiden Kameras auf dieselbe Uhrzeit gestellt.
So synchronizing the cameras.
Der zweite Kameramann begleitet Pam und unsere Redakteurin. Es ist 11 Uhr Vormittag. Das Experiment beginnt. Weder die Eltern zu Hause noch Pam wissen, wann wir zurückkommen werden. Wird JT auch unter diesen Bedingungen reagieren und Pam am Fenster erwarten. Wir begleiten Pam in das nahegelegene Städtchen Ramsbottom. Nur wir selbst der Kameramann, der mit JT zu Hause geblieben ist, weiß nicht, wann wir zurückkommen werden.
So he's emphasizing that neither Pam nor the cameraman nor her parents know when she's going home.
Es ist kurz vor 13 Uhr. Die Hälfte der Zeit für das Experiment ist bereits abgelaufen. Das wissen allerdings nur wir. Denn, wie schon gesagt, den Zeitpunkt der Rückkehr halten wir nach wie vor geheim. Weder Pam noch ihre Eltern zu Hause wissen, wann wir zurückkehren werden. Ob der Versuch gelingen wird, ist nach wie vor offen. Niemand kann voraussagen, ob JT unter Testbedingungen wie immer reagieren wird oder ob Kamera und Scheinwerfer ihn irritieren. Nun wird es ernst. Es ist 10 vor 3. Unsere Redakteurin gibt das Zeichen für den sofortigen Aufbruch.
This is the randomly chosen time. They're telling Pam to go home now. She's been out for about nearly 4 hours.
Um 14 Uhr, 50 Minuten und 33 Sekunden. 11 Sekunden nach unserem Verlangen. Allerdings wissen wir das zu diesem Zeitpunkt noch nicht. Um es für den Hund noch schwieriger zu machen, haben wir uns schon vorher entschieden, mit einem Taxi zurückzufahren, damit JT das Motorengeräusch von Pams Auto nicht erkennen kann. Hause nicht mehr vom Fenster weg, während Pam im Taxi auf dem Weg zu ihm ist. Dabei spielt es keine Rolle, ob Pam an ihn denkt oder nicht. Genauso wie in den Experimenten, die sie für Rupert Sheldrake mit ihm gemacht hat, lässt sich JT auch diesmal nicht irritieren. Erwartungsvoll sitzt er am Fenster, als das Taxi vorfährt.
So he spent all 15 minutes of a homeward journey waiting by the window.
Zugegeben, uns selbst hat das Ergebnis verblüfft. Erklärungen können wir Ihnen dafür keine anbieten. Wir erheben allerdings auch nicht den Anspruch eines wissenschaftlichen Experiments. Wir können Ihnen nur zeigen, was wir mit eigenen Augen gesehen haben. Wenn Sie selbst ähnliche Erlebnisse mit Ihrem Haustier haben, bitte schreiben Sie uns. Wir leiten Ihre Briefe an Rupert Sheldrake weiter und Sie werden somit Teilnehmer an den Experimenten auf der Suche nach dem sechsten Sinn.
I just don't, in the short remaining time, I want to say something about research on human telepathy. I've done a lot of work on animal telepathy. You'll find that summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. But these things occur in the human realm too. Of course, there's been research on telepathy for more than 100 years. Probably the most convincing evidence comes from people's own experience. This is what convinces people more than any amount of scientific data. And most people have had telepathic experiences. It's common. It's often called paranormal, but it's not paranormal in the sense it's rare. It's actually very common. It's only paranormal in the sense it doesn't fit into the mechanistic theory of nature within science. It does fit into a wider view of science, as I've suggested, through morphic fields. But some of the experiments done in university parapsychology labs have unfortunately not been well designed to take into account the nature of telepathy. They test complete strangers, with one of them looking at meaningless stimuli in one room and the other supposed to guess them in another. Well, telepathy doesn't usually work with emotionally neutral, meaningless situations, nor does it work with strangers. It's surprising these experiments give significant results. They do. They, on the whole, give weak but significant results. In real life, telepathy occurs most commonly with people who are strongly bonded. Parents and children, lovers, husbands and wives, best friends, close colleagues, therapists and clients who've got an emotional transference going, things like that. It doesn't happen between strangers, typically. I've done a whole range of studies on human telepathy. I don't have time to discuss them all now. One involves studies on telepathy between mothers and babies, where I found that nursing mothers were indeed highly sensitive to their baby's needs. Many of them had milk let down reflexes. Their milk got ready to feed the baby when the baby was crying and needed them miles away. We've done quantitative studies on this showing that this does seem to be a real phenomenon, which is no surprise to a lot of women who've actually experienced it. But in science, you have to try and prove these things. I've looked at various other aspects of telepathy, summarized in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At, and other aspects of the extended mind. But here I'm just going to talk about two. One is telephone telepathy, which turns out to be by far the commonest in the modern world. This is the phenomenon. You think of someone for no apparent reason, then the phone rings and you say, oh, it's funny, I was just thinking about you. Surveys show that about 80% of the population have had this experience. And these data show the difference between men and women. Women have it more than men all over the world, in all the places I've surveyed it. But over 70% of men have this too. There were national differences. Argentinian men were the most sensitive, British men the least. When we look at other forms of telepathy, again, women more than men, but you see telephone telepathy is way above the frequency of other kinds of telepathy. It's the commonest kind in the modern world. It's evolved along with technology. How many people here have had that kind of experience with phone calls? Well, that's certainly an overwhelming majority. Now, skeptics have dismissed this for generations, and their standard way of dismissing it is to say, oh, it's just a coincidence. You think of people all the time, someone rings, then you foolishly imagine it's telepathy. You just forget all the thousands of times you think about people and they don't ring. So it's just nothing but coincidence and a trick of selective memory. That's been the armchair skeptical hypothesis for years. However, they don't have a shred of evidence to back it up. In science, you need more than just an armchair hypothesis. It would be easy if that's all you needed. No, you need data, and they don't have any. Well, I've designed a very simple test. How it works is this. If you're the subject, you give me the names of 4 people you might be telepathic with and their phone numbers. You sit at home with a landline phone being videotaped. During the experiment, we pick one of the 4 senders by the throw of a die at random, ring them up and ask them to call you. They call you, the phone rings. You know it's one of these 4 people, but you don't know which one. Before you pick the phone up, you have to say who. I think it's Jill. Pick it up, hi Jill. You're right or you're wrong. And there's a 1 in 4 chance of being right by just guessing, 25%. In fact, in these experiments, the hit rate, that's the chance level, there's the hit rate, it's 45%, and this is very significantly above chance. For those of you into statistics, the p-value here, this is hundreds of trials involved, is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. Billions to 1, the odds against it being a chance result. We then did the experiment where 2 senders were strangers and the others were familiar callers. And what we found is that with the strangers, the chance rate was very close to chance. With the familiar callers, it was over 50%, showing that it works best with familiar people, which is exactly what you'd expect with telepathy. These telephone telepathy tests show no effective distance. We did these tests with some of the callers in Australia or New Zealand, recruiting young Australians and New Zealanders from the Earls Court area, who'd recently come to London, whose nearest and dearest were down under. They actually did better with their nearest and dearest down under than they did with new acquaintances here in Britain, showing that what matters is not physical distance, but emotional closeness. Very much the same thing happens with emails. People, it's the latest evolution of telepathy. People think of someone and then they get an email from them. And we've done a very similar test with emails. 4 emailers chosen at random. You have to guess who's about to email you just before you get the email. And these you're filmed. The chance rate would be 25%. Here again in the email test, there's the chance rate, 25%. The actual score was 47%, a very significant result. Again, we found the same effect. Strangers were much less effective than familiar people, over 60% success rate with familiar people. Again, bearing out the idea telepathy depends on social or emotional bonds. And again, we found no effective distance, higher hit rate with familiar callers. The latest development of this is automated online tests. And I'd like to invite you to take part in these. I have, on my website, sheldrake.org, I have several tests at the moment. The ones I'd like to draw your attention to, particularly the joint attention test. You do this with 1 other person, you're logged on at the same time. The question is, can you tell when the other person's looking at the same picture as you? There's a series of 20 10-second trials. It only takes 4 minutes. It's giving very significant results at present, and I'm terribly keen to get more data. So do please have a go at that. It's fun to do. It only takes 4 minutes. It's easy to log on. You just need 1 other person to do it with, logged on at the same time. All the instructions are given on the website. Now, for those of you who use text messages, I have an automated text message telepathy test that works on your mobile phone. That, again, is easy to do. You log on online, and then the computer randomly selects one of your senders. In this case, there are 3 senders. Sends them a text asking them to write you a message. They write you a message. They send it back to the computer. It then texts you and says, there's a message from one of your 3 senders. Who's it from? You text back your answer. You get the message. And after a random time delay, it does it again. 6 trials make up a complete test. Fun to do. You can do it anywhere you like. But, of course, you have to be a mobile phone user. I'm not. So I had to buy one specially to do my own tests. But it doesn't come very naturally to me. So it may not come naturally to some of you. But if it does, give it a go. And even better, try, I haven't mentioned it here, I have a new version of this, the precognitive text test, where you make your guess before the sender's been selected. Can you do it precognitively? The advantage of precognition is there's no way of cheating in a precognition test, so you can do them under much more relaxed conditions without having to have skeptics breathing down your neck and checking every move and so on, which a rigorous telepathy test has to involve. So precognition tests are much easier. It's a very similar procedure, but have a go at that. And then there's an automated email telepathy test. You log on, you have 3 emailers. The computer sends them emails telling them when to email you. You just do this as part of your normal life. You don't have to stay at any particular time at the computer. Very relaxed, fun to do. And finally, I'd like to mention a new initiative here, the Research Helper Programme. My work is now funded from Trinity College, Cambridge, from the Perrett-Warwick Fund, and it's made it much easier to do this research with a more regular form of income to keep the show on the road. And as part of that, I've launched a Research Helper Programme, and at the moment I'm appointing research helpers to help with this research. What the research helpers do is organize some of their friends to do these tests. In the case of the precognitive text test, you do it yourself, you recruit 5 other people to do it as subjects. That's all. And I'm also asking people to do some joint attention tests as part of this, or the email telepathy test. If you don't do text messages, then you can do the email telepathy test. If you're interested in being a research helper, the details are given on my website. There's a limited number available this month of appointments. You do get paid, not much, but you do get paid, and you get a certificate of research experience from the Perrett-Warwick project. So this is something you might like to do yourselves. It's something that's proved very popular among people in lower 6th forms because it adds to their CV for university applications. Although when they're applying to some universities, they're probably best advised not to say it was for telepathy research. So this is so if you'd like to be involved in this, here's a way you can be. If you're not interested in being a research helper yourself, encourage someone you know to do this. This research in these automated tests could go a long way fast. Last week I was invited, slightly to my surprise, to go to Austria, to a remote castle in Austria, where I found myself addressing the 100 top executives of Nokia, the telephone company. They've got very interested in this research. And what they're thinking of doing, and I'm working with them now, is setting up an automated experiment on your Nokia phone, where when the phone call comes in, instead of giving the caller ID display, there'd be a question mark. It'd say, who's calling? And you could have a telepathy feature built into every Nokia phone. There's a billion Nokia phones out there in the world at the moment. So this could take research to a totally new level. I've also been approached by social networking websites and indeed by AOL and Google about some of my other online tests. If these would be fun to do, they're cheap, they're simple, they're easy, people enjoy doing them. If these tests work, and if they can be streamlined a bit, they could go public in a huge way, taking this kind of research onto a totally new level. And you could be part of that process. I'm not ready to go public with these yet because we need more data on what variables affect it and so forth. But these experiments could have a big future. Well, I'll just end by saying that what I've been talking about, morphic fields, is really a way of looking at the way things are organized. These organizing fields with a built-in memory are part of this larger shift to a field paradigm, which Lynn has written about and which we're all talking about this weekend. They're the fields of organization that make systems at all levels of complexity what they are. They underlie our mental activity, our behavior. They connect us with each other and with the environment. They connect members of social groups in animal societies. They connect different parts of the body. They are interconnecting fields. And they are, I think, what underlies the interconnectedness of nature. When we shift from the old reductionist mechanist paradigm to a holistic paradigm, I think these fields are going to be a major part of it. And they not only interconnect in space, they interconnect in time by giving a collective memory. Our brains are like receivers. They're not where it's all happening, as Lynn mentioned. And we're interconnected not only in space with our environment and each other, but in time through our collective memory to large numbers of other people in the past. Well, there you have it, a brief summary, and I haven't time to take questions now, but there may be a chance for you to ask me if you have any during the course of this conference. I should be here most of the time. Thank you.